I want to welcome everyone and take it away, Christy.
Thanks, Dasha. All right, so thank you guys for joining us today. As Dasha mentioned, we are going over emergency action planning for child-based programming. So welcome everyone. Please, as Dasha mentioned, mention in the chat where you're from, whether you're Parks and Recreation, are you an independent, do you work with a YMCA? That information might help us tailor some of our answers and help you get some very specific information for your programs. So quick agenda for today. I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to introduce you to the ePACT team here. You already know our names, Dasha and Kirsty, but I'll tell you a bit about us. And then I'm going to introduce you to Fraser, our guest today. And then him and I are going to discuss what he does for emergency action planning. And finally, we will have a question period. And what we're not showing on the agenda, but we're going to do is a couple of little bonuses for those people who attended today. So we will go over that as well. So don't leave before the end because there's some extra treats for you. As far as housekeeping, if you have any questions, please place it in the Q&A chat box. Dasha's going to be keeping an eye on that. Still be able to let us know what those questions are so that we can share the answers with the whole team. If for any reason we somehow don't get to your question, don't worry, we can follow up with you afterwards and make sure that all of your questions are answered. A copy of these slides and the recording of this presentation will be sent afterwards. So that's an important note. You were warned when you joined, you are being recorded. Don't worry, you're not going to have to speak or be on camera. So nothing embarrassing, but we will send that recording. So if you want to refer back to anything you've learned today, you will have that. If you want to share it with your team, please do. You are welcome to share it. And then after it's complete, please feel free to reach out to Dasha. Dasha's going to put her email in the chat for you guys. She's also going to be reaching out to you afterwards. If you have questions about ePACT or just questions in general about emergency action planning, please let us know. So as far as the team, my name is Christy. I am the sales and marketing manager here at ePACT. That means that I'm the one that has to talk to you all about how wonderful we are and see whether it fits your needs and whether ePACT is the right route for your organization, should you be interested in that. Dasha is our marketing and business development representative. So it's her job to kind of first assess your organization, see if there might be a fit there, really educate people on the basics of ePACT. Plus, of course, reach out to you for things like this webinar. Fraser is here joining us today as a guest. He's not associated with ePACT. He does a lot, though. We were just talking about him having to go out to the Maritimes for work, and then he was over here in Vancouver, which is where I'm based, and now he's back in Victoria. He is currently the team coach and senior instructor at Royal Victoria Yacht Club, where he is responsible for all of these emergency action plans. And I don't know if any of you here are into boating, but if you are, you know that emergencies happen and it is somewhere that you have to be on the ball. You have to be prepared. You cannot be figuring out what to do on the fly when something happens. He's also the head sailing coach for the Royal Military College of Canada, sailing manager and race coach for the was for the Kingston Yacht Club. Don't want to pretend you're everything, Fraser. I apologize. And he's also worked with the Canadian Forces as a provincial coach, race team coach, and regional sail program maintainer. So this guy knows safety inside and out in some of the most critical situations you can face. So welcome, Fraser. Thank you so much for joining us today. All right, so let's get started. So Fraser, first, I'd love for you to just talk to us a bit about what being prepared means to you as an instructor and facilitator.
Yeah, of course. So hello, everybody. I am Fraser Smith. So what does it mean to be prepared as an instructor and facilitator? So for me, the big points that I had down were knowing your environment and knowing your students. So I've worked with youth, worked with adults, worked with accessibility programs, and you have to tailor your mindset as well as the literal equipment and stuff that you bring to all the different groups that you have. Analyzing the risks that come with whatever age group or group in general, as well as the location, especially with sailing, that is huge, and prepping your resources and equipment to meet said risks. So in our case of coaching on an ocean versus coaching on a lake, you have different expectations when it comes to what a rescue means and how bad situations can get. generally on a lake, for example, you're dealing with the same water safety issues when it comes to potential drowning or otherwise, but you don't necessarily have to deal with tide and being pulled out to sea and there being a coast guard to be able to come and assist. So even just taking a bird's eye view of the situation and looking at all the different factors is the best way to start for being prepared. It doesn't always necessarily mean just bringing every bit of safety equipment possible for every situation, but tailoring it to the environment that you're in.
That is so critical. If I've talked to any of you before, you know I'm a big sailor. I live on a sailboat half the time, and it's on the ocean, and things like wind over tide, you can't control. You've got to plan for, you've got to know what's going to happen. And that's the thing, is being prepared for all the different inevitabilities. And that applies on the water or in a classroom. So thanks, Fraser. So let's talk about your environment. At the Royal Victoria Yacht Club, you talked about tailoring to the environment. So can you give some examples of how you do that to provide that safe care?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to say that we make sure to take and try to receive as much feedback from parents as well as just customers, kids, adults, you name it, anybody that goes through the program or is adjacent to the program. We try to take their feedback and input that back into our practices. So like I said, us being on the ocean at our club, we have a big break wall. It's the West Coast, so we got a lot of rocks sticking out of the water. We have set buoys in areas that we always train in, and ideas that we drill into our students' heads every time that we leave the dock, and before we even put them in a boat, as to where to go, how we're exiting the harbor. And that's just one of the more obvious ones, but it's one that parents tend to be the most concerned about. They come down to a club, they might not necessarily know what sailing as a sport is, and they see a lot of risks that come with being on the water, and especially having younger people in the water by themselves or with one or two other people. So we like to start kind of from the outside in, start with the bigger, more obvious ones that tend to get broken down, and we can see some other areas of risk we have to assess. Another way that we try to mitigate this is by hiring coaches that have worked at a lot of different programs. Because there might be a more obvious risk at another club, whether it be with the physical environment itself or with the programs that they run, that experience can be brought in. We also have to deal with having a large membership of private members at the club. So adults that are always around the club and on their boats and doing club activities. So we tend to have a lot of like member on student interactions, positive and otherwise, that are a big part of the environment. Having, a membership of close to 1,000 people, with a good chunk of our program during the summer not being necessarily members' children, so it's members of the community. We really have to make sure that we have like a safe barrier and safe practices when dealing with members as well. So those are the two big factors in our environment, really, are the physical parts and the fairly obvious ones, but also the member interactions as well.
Thank you. And I've got another question that I hadn't planned for. You're talking a lot about tailoring the plan and taking feedback from parents and tailoring it to the child. Would you say, we're going to get to the plan in a second and talk about what it contains and everything, but would you say that that plan ends up being a bit of a living document, that what might be in place one day might be different the next day because you've learned more about that environment or about that individual?
Oh, absolutely. I was going to mention that the EAP that got from the club, the document, the non-physical version, has been around since it looks like 2013. So we're reaching like a decade of it being constantly edited, right? So nobody's made a new one and made a new file. We've had the same document that we've constantly been updating, not just with different contact information or different things that have happened on the property, but yeah, based off of experience. And like the example that I'll talk about later is something that we factored in as well. So yeah, it's definitely a living document. It's when I go and I facilitate instructor evaluations and stuff at other clubs, and it takes somebody like 15 to 20 minutes to dig up the EAP and it's printed off and it says it's from 2017. You just really hope that nothing crazy has happened between then and now, and there wasn't much need for change. But yeah, it's definitely a living document.
I can't imagine no need for change since 2017. I mean, we're constantly
Exactly.
learning and improving, right?
Yeah, there's been some significant changes when it comes to risk and environment and safety in the last 3 years, you could say. So yeah.
Well, and I would think in your world also rules and regulations, things change, and that's very pertinent to childcare. If you're running licensed programs, your licensing authority might have one thing to say one year and then it changes next year. So that's incredibly relevant to this audience from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. One point I had here for this slide as well was obviously as a sport, we have a national sporting authority, which is Sail Canada for us. And they have pretty solid general guidelines and essentially emergency action plans that you can adapt for your club, as well as all the instructor training that all of our certified instructors do always hammer this stuff home. So you come into any job in the sailing world in Canada, at least, no matter where it is, with a good idea of what to look for in terms of an EAP, or at least how to work with one. So that's kind of another preset way where the environment is tailored for the most part, is just choosing to adhere by those standards. So
Perfect. Thanks for adding that color. So we've been talking about EAPs. We're using that acronym, but EAP obviously means Emergency Action Plan. The people on this webinar may already have one in place that they're looking to improve upon, or they may be learning about them because they don't have one and they need to put one in it. So Fraser, in your words, how would you explain to somebody who doesn't have an EAP? What would you call that EAP? How would you describe it to someone?
I like to describe an EAP as a document with all the information that you would need at a base level to deal with an emergency situation at the club, in our case, at a yacht club. But it should be a document that anybody is able to pick up that is on the premises and can use to contact the correct authorities, and be able to at least baseline handle an emergency situation. So it shouldn't be something overcomplicated, but it also shouldn't be so simplified that it just says call 911. You definitely hope that it's somewhere in the middle, but it should be something that is used by everybody, or it be able to be used by everybody. In our case with sailing, obviously we have a couple extra steps when it comes to getting people off of the water, as well as other water sports and other camps may have. You want your EAP to extend to the farthest reaches of what your organization or program does. So that way you're not leaving up anything to chance.
Yeah, keep that worst case scenario in mind. Hope you never need it, but make sure you're prepared if you do.
Exactly. Plan for the worst, hope for the best, et cetera, et cetera.
So, I mean, you've mentioned that you already have an emergency action plan that's the template that's been there since 2013.
Yep.
How do you look at that and modify it? Or if you were to create it from the start, how do you make that plan? How do you figure out what needs to go into it?
So kind of bringing it back to the first slide that we were talking about is assessing risk, with yet again, your environment, as well as your students or otherwise your consumers. Looking at all the potential variables that go into the job that you're doing. So in our case, it's coaching sailing. We have equipment, fairly heavy and large equipment, which in amongst itself, before it leaves the dock, is a factor we have to think about. We have a portion of going on the water, which carries all of those risks as well, dealing with membership. So already when talking with staff or running through previous students and gaining feedback, you can start to collect where all your main points of contention are for safety. And slowly you start to build up, well, yeah, a solid list of points that you would like to address in one document, that clearly covers how to deal with all of the most common situations, but yet again, leaving nothing untouched. So in Sail Canada's case, there used to always be a requirement to have an EAP or some form of document at the club. And with the old standard with that, it really just boiled down to emergency services and a meeting point. And that's where the idea of it started. And this was a long time ago in the 70s. And then slowly they realized of all the things that they assumed were common sense that weren't necessarily common when it came to getting people off of the water. Most people would assume that you get them to the closest point of land that reaches a roadway. But when you build up a certain amount of situations and cases across the country where people did not make that correct decision in an adrenaline-filled moment, you start to see the need to explain these things in that document as well. So in our EAP, just for a quick example, we throw down the quick basic first steps of first aid care, emergency first aid care, which is really just assessing the scene, making sure you have control of the situation, analyzing all the other risks to not put yourself at risk while dealing with it, points on how to deal with when you're with a group of 7 boats on the water and you're the one coach boat there and you have one boat that needs your help. What do you do with the other 5? How to do a handoff, which radio calls to make, who you're talking to, and then slowly you have a plan that, while still simplified down to ours in this case, not including the title page, is a 6-page document. You can quickly run through any situation. It has all the common ones, but at the end of the day, they all have the same baseline for contacting the same people, going to the same place, and having the same routine afterwards to debrief and address the situation.
Perfect. Thank you for going into that detail on that. That's really helpful and interesting. So, I mean, I think you kind of already answered this one as far as what do you include in that emergency action plan? Is there anything we haven't already discussed that you think is important to make sure is in a plan?
Yeah, so one thing that I was gonna make note of is that, especially for dealing with youth and like a youth summer sailing school or any sort of program, you tend to carry a lot of the same risks that come with a school. And elementary schools, high schools have very similar action plans that tend to be on the back of classroom doors and like a little see-through folder most of the time. And you'll find the same thing in doctor's offices and medical places and most government places, some form of an action plan. And I always find that working from a school one is always a pretty good place to start as well for an in-depth plan. So they have anything that deals with, unwanted adult on the premises, hostile intruder, tsunami guidelines, fire guidelines, and they tend to have a lot of stuff that you can take and adapt. So those are all things that are included as well. It's just in general environmental things. So not necessarily the environment as we were talking about it before, but quite literally when it comes to, in our case, waiting for the big one, for an earthquake, tsunami, everything like that. And to bring it back again, all of those have a meeting point that tend to be fairly similar. In our case, our tsunami one is a little bit farther up the road because we are, I want to say, at high tide, maybe 2 meters above sea level. So yeah, ours is a little bit farther away. But yeah, other than that, I think we've covered the basics of what we include at the very least.
And for the audience, when Fraser references the big one, we on the West Coast grew up knowing that we're going to have the big earthquake. It was inevitable within 10 years when I was in elementary school. And frankly, it's been more than 10 years since elementary school. Don't want to admit how many 10 years, but that we've been prepared, and we used to do drills, and we had that clear paper or clearly marked paper on the back of the door so that anybody could pick up that action plan and respond, even in my elementary school days. And so it's definitely, schools are a great resource to turn to, especially when it comes to those natural disasters. And we all need to be aware of the different ones. For example, Florida, I don't know if we have anyone from Florida today, but I was talking to a city down there that is still recovering from their last hurricane, and it's really interesting learning about that. Up here, we don't need to worry about a hurricane, but we need to be very aware of a tsunami. So you need to know what your local environmental factors are for sure. All right. So how do you enact these emergency action plans?
So is this where I'm able to go into a little bit of an example?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Want to share your screen, or are you going to tell a story?
Perfect. So One of the better examples of an emergency action plan being put into place and then also immediately being adapted after the situation was I was working up in Comox one summer, which is up on the halfway up Vancouver Island up here on the West Coast. We were up there at a regatta. I believe Dasher might have been around as well. And there was a younger sailor sailing in Opti, so they were probably they could have been anywhere from 7 to 10, who right before a start of a race, somebody noticed that their boat wasn't moving and that he was lying down in the bottom of the boat. Somebody went over and checked, and it looked like that he had gotten hit in the head by the boom, and he was essentially knocked out, sitting in the bottom of his boat. As per our emergency action plan, when you have, especially with a neck and spinal injury, the next goal is using the safest way possible when it comes to first aid, supporting the head to get them into the coach boat, into our motorboat, and then drive them to the meeting point, which is right off of a road, right by a pier, essentially 5 minutes from the local hospital. Now, the issue was that the person, the coach dealing with the sailor, was from one club. One of the people that was calling emergency services was from a different club. And then the sailor was from a third different club. So we had a little bit of a conflict when it came to that, because we had two separate emergency action plans being put into place essentially at one time. So one that called for them to meet at one place, one that called for another. So that itself in this situation led to two separate ambulances going two separate places and a coach trying to figure out where to go. Now, before I jump that far ahead, another part of this story is that yet again, we have a sailor kind of knocked out in the bottom of their boat. They're laying down, potential head, neck, spinal injury. You don't want to necessarily move them. You move them when it comes to the point of a life situation, then you want to get them out of the scenario. But as it was a little bit calmer out, it wasn't necessarily the normal environment that would lead to this happening. We came to the conclusion that to preserve any potential neck and spinal injury, we were able to lift the entire boat and put it on top of the motorboat, essentially using the kids' little boat as a spine board, so without having to move them. And that was something that was taken and thrown in as a little side note onto a lot of clubs' EAPs for that specific type of boat, which is easy enough to lift up. You couldn't do it with much else. But even that little point was something mentioned that was super important. And then the second point that came out of it, to bring it back again, is which EAP are we choosing to use? In that case, we decided to go with the person that is providing like essentially the primary care and the main person that is handling the situation. So whether that's the first coach on the scene or just whoever starts calling the shots, we roll with that and we try to keep in line. And part of the EAP that was touched on ahead of the incident in the EAP was who is calling emergency services as well, because there was multiple people all around the situation who weren't addressed as to what the EAP was, or had been coaching for a while and hadn't necessarily done a course where they had to check their EAP or go over it. So there's just too many people calling emergency services and too many cooks in the kitchen. So I think a big point to make is that after every time an EAP is used at our club, or even when I've seen it otherwise, it is always best to have a big debrief afterwards, pretty much as soon as you can, with the people that were involved, to be able to go over these talking points and adapt the EAP if necessary.
Wow. That story just gave me chills. I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old who sail. So hearing that was like a punch in the gut, thinking about that poor kid. And thank God that even though you were working with different EAPs, you guys managed to pull it together and help them. And to bring that story back to our audience, I mean, most of you here are childcare providers. Some of you are involved more in the summer camps, but some of you are involved in the after school environment, and you might be providing care in that school. And that's an area where you might have two EAPs in place. And that's a really important detail to know, whose are you following and who's going to be in charge if that emergency comes up. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I also just wanted to mention that like to the point on the previous slide as to how they're enacted. Generally, most EAPs, when they are split up into their different scenarios and how to deal with the different common scenarios, they tend to be nice, big, and bolded, which makes it easy to go through and see when you've kind of met the requirements for the EAP to be enacted. An easy, safe bet is generally any time that borderline requires emergency services, or you have a child really getting hurt at all, you are enacting the EAP in some way. It doesn't necessarily going full steam to emergency services if the situation doesn't call for it. But you can use the first 3 steps of an EAP. You don't just have to pull it out when you're using all 5. So that was just one point I wanted to make.
Yeah, you don't always need to lift the boat onto your boat.
Exactly.
It might have been able to move safely, but it's good to have that step in there as a possibility. So I think we kind of skipped ahead there and we told this story. So we will bypass this slide. Yeah, no, but that was an amazing story to share, and I'm hoping the child was okay. I'm going to assume the child was okay.
Oh, yeah, they were fine, and it turned out being not even really of their own accord. Another boat sailing by, their boom kind of clipped them, and nobody saw it happen. So,
oh no.
Yeah.
Hopefully that boat also learned from that circumstance.
They did. They did.
That must have felt terrible on their part. So we're going to wrap it up, or get towards wrapping it up here. But in summary, like an emergency action plan, correct me if I'm wrong here, Fraser, but it is a paper that is easily accessible and easy to read. You mentioned bolded headlines that you can just glance at and you know what's going on, and it'll outline those steps and what information you need and what you need to do and how you need to react in any incident or emergency, whether it's a small one or a major one. Would that be a fairly good summarization for you?
I would say that put it a lot more. That's a lot more concise than my long-winded explanation. But yes,
your long-winded had all the details that my concise one didn't include. So we're a good pair on that one. All right. So as far as what emergency action plans include, and please add color if I'm missing something here, you've got to have your contact personnel and contact numbers, also emergency services. In particular, if you've got any different services, so like you mentioned in your case, Coast Guard's important. Coast Guard obviously isn't important for an after school location in the school, but maybe the principal is, and maybe, you know, there's somewhere like a school security officer that might be important to have there. So it's really making sure those relevant contact information is in place, where your meeting points are and why you might need to go to them, steps for both major and minor injuries or incidents, steps for evacuation if that's needed, and of course, locations of key items like first aid kits, phones, where's the address to the hospital, where's your current location. You don't want someone in an emergency going, I don't know, I'm in a school somewhere in this neighborhood. You need that exact address. Would that be accurate? Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that was a good point to throw at the end. Actually, is I think at the very front of our EAP. Let me just double check. Yeah, the first thing is a gigantic address.
Perfect. Yeah, and in sailing that can be different. I've had emergencies on the water, not needing Coast Guard or anything, but having to call CETO, which is our local paid for rescue company. And I've got to be like, I am X nautical miles off of this point. You always have to be aware of where you are. That is so critical.
Totally.
All right. So a note for everybody. I mentioned that we're giving you a couple of things towards the end. I want you to make sure you all check your inbox. It'll probably be coming in either later today or tomorrow. I'm not going to make promises for her, but Dash is actually going to send you a sample EAP. It's going to be in an editable document, so you can use that as a template for your programs if you don't already have one in place, or you can take some learnings from it and add it to your existing EAP. We want to be able to enable you to get the best plan in place to protect those kiddos. All right, so we've come to the key point of the questions. Dasha, do we have some questions for Fraser or myself? But I'm mainly
Yeah.
throw Fraser
We
into the fire.
well, maybe you could add something to it, but we have a couple of keeners already emailed in. But if you want to add them to the chat, but how do you identify a good muster point? So you kind of mentioned that you have a lot of members and guests that come. What is a good way to identify a muster point and kind of brief people on it?
Yeah, so in our case, as a quick example, I think I mentioned it earlier, for us coming off the water, we always like to pick somewhere that is visible from the water and the roadway and as close as possible to a roadway just for emergency services, or generally an easiest means of at least on foot exiting the property. It should also be a spot that people are quite familiar with. So at a lot of clubs I've worked at, or other jobs as well, it's always been some identifiable object in an area, that you would be able to pick up on quite quickly. And even if somebody had not read the EAP and had a description, they would know where to go. Um, so in our case, for like tsunami stuff or anything along those lines, or the earthquake stuff, we have a point up the road that we head to like the one stop sign in that one general area that's pretty hard to miss. And then down the one dock that's near the closest point of land is our meeting point for coming off the water. Um, so yeah, easiest access for ambulance or otherwise, a place that everybody can recognize, and that's easily describable in the EAP.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. You're just saying that I'm also from Victoria, so I know the stop sign, I know the dock, so it's those are good muster points then. Perfect. And then we have another one. Someone who is running kind of a program that is more in a rural location and it takes a while to get to the hospital. Do you have any recommendations of what they should put in their EAP, or if there's like a place that they should go to, like urgent care that would be better, or what would you recommend in that case?
I would say that, well, you made a good point. Having different scales for the necessity for medical help. So we're lucky enough that we're closer to a hospital than we are almost to a clinic. So we can essentially go to the emergency room or put down the hospital to deal with most situations. Um, you might have to have a little bit more description when it comes to, yeah, the sliding scale of the emergency and where to go first. Super rural, looking at a potential like helicopter meetup spot, like landing spot, as simple and or crazy as that might sound. I have definitely been in places where that is the best option, and that is probably who's going to come and get you first. So having an identified area where you can go to meet up with a helicopter crew in case of an emergency, and how you could potentially get somebody there as well. Um, or an ambulance meetup spot that's somewhere off the property that you know, based off of the equipment and resources you have, that you could maybe get somebody to. Because I've also seen that enacted in kind of mobile sailing programs that go to rural areas that always have a vehicle with them, um, or at least multiple, where there are meetup spots off the property part way, where they could reach emergency services, or emergency services could meet up with them and then carry on the job past there. So I think it would just require, even though it seems like it would require less because the answer is pretty simple. You're either going to need a helicopter or try to find a way to get there yourself if it's very rural. But you're going to need a little bit more description, um, to identify when you're going to take that next step, because the steps are obviously a little bit bigger, than it is for us. So those are the tips that I would have for that.
Yeah, definitely. And they kind of added also a little tidbit. Do you recommend adding maps then of like where like they should go, like kind of like a little drawing? Because sometimes they're mentioning that it's a little bit difficult, but was that something that you'd recommend as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I should have said that earlier. On our EAP, we have, I mean, this is very specific, but we have a gigantic drone photo of the
Oh,
entire club with like a star where all the meetup points are, but Google Maps, um, the topographical one or otherwise, those are all great. And looking at our EAP has both. So a map to the hospital with like 2 separate routes, as well as a map of the property with the meetup points and all that stuff and otherwise. So yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, wow, that was not English. While the last couple of questions are coming in, do you have kind of any other little details that you want to share with anyone? While we give people like 30 seconds to type, because I know I speak fast sometimes. So
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the point about debriefing after you use an EAP, even if it's fairly minimal, because that is how, when we were talking about it being a living document, that's how it stays a living document. And it's very easy to enact an EAP. It works well enough and the situation turns out fine, where it very easily couldn't have. And you tend to have those best realizations fairly quickly afterwards, if not even in the moment, when you've been frustrated by something not working necessarily. So debriefing after using it and taking that as an opportunity to adapt and change that document. The classic no plan survives first contact. So you can have the best EAP that's like 12 pages long, and it could have less relevant information than one that is 6 after taking some time to narrow it down and simplify it a little bit. And on that point, I would say try not to have an EAP that's like 15 pages long, because anything that's longer really than 6 or maybe 7 pages very quickly becomes a book in people's eyes. So they will either do what you don't really want them to do, which is improvise in those situations, or it'll take a little long to come up with the right chain of command or chain of events or what have you to deal with the situation. So it has to be concise, and it has to have the full scope of what you're dealing with. You do not have to go into every single what if situation, as long as your base level how to deal with the situation could cover all of them with it being overkill. You would rather that than have just the bare minimum of what you need.
yeah, perfect. Excuse my upstairs neighbors there, just adding their little tidbit into that and wanted their say as well. But we just had that one kind of follow-up question, is that yes, we will be providing an EAP, thankfully. That'll be attached into the emails that I'll send out later. But other than that, I'll pass this back to Christy, as those are all of our questions for now. If you have any more, feel free to email me. Danielle has added my email into the chat there if you'd like.
Thanks, Dasha. So one other thing is a thank you for participating. We mentioned in the email that there would be some special offers. If you choose to learn more about ePACT and if it's a good fit for your program, we would like to offer you with complimentary auto archiving. That means we save your files for however long you need them saved. I've got one client that needs it until after the individual's 21st birthday. So if they're in childcare since 1 year old, you need to store it for 20 years. We can take all of the management of that off your plate. If you're not familiar with who ePACT is yet, please do reach out to Dasha to learn about us. We help you in emergencies by getting all of the individual information for your participants. Apparently my English isn't working now. In one really easy to read format, searchable, filterable, so you can find out who all of your participants with allergies are, for example, so you can come up with a plan for those allergies that's specific to your participants. We do all of that for you, and we store it for you in an offline accessible environment, which is very key for making sure that you can reach that information in an emergency. I won't bore you with any more about ePACT now, but please do reach out to Dasha if you are interested in learning more. As she mentioned, her email is in the chat. She's also going to be emailing all of you a copy of that EAP afterwards and a recording of this webinar and the slides. So you will have her information if you have any questions. And then just thank you all for being here today. Thank you for giving us your time. It's been wonderful to get to chat with you, Fraser. So thank you as well. I hope you've all learned something. If you have learned something that was kind of key that you didn't know before, again, please reach out to us and let us know. And if there's something else you want to learn, email Dasha and tell us, because we're going to be doing more webinars as the year proceeds, and we want to teach you what you need to learn. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a fabulous day. Take care.